there is a small ritual that will change you more than any grand plan ever could. It asks nothing of you but one quiet commitment each morning, to be a fraction better than you were yesterday. This is not a promise to become famous, wealthy, or admired. It is a promise to yourself, measured in the smallest acts you can repeat, without drama. If you resist the temptation to dramatize, to leap for transformation, and instead choose the slow, surgical act of improvement, you begin to move under your own weight. This is the work of a warrior who fights mostly in silence. Centuries ago, Miyamoto Musashi wrote a short book called The Book of Five Rings, a manual of strategy that at first glance is about swordsmanship. In truth, Musashi was teaching a way of life, how to cut away what is unnecessary, how to stand unshaken amid motion, how to let skill replace fear. He described practice not as a performance, but as a quiet, relentless refining of habit. There is a phrase in his writing that rings in the ears of anyone who has sat alone with their faults: become accustomed to the small things. Musashi's way was not an eruption. It was the accumulation of tiny, exacting choices. To compete with yesterday is to follow that way. Consider a man named Haru. He is not a legend. He does not wake at dawn to train with wooden swords beneath a temple bell. He is a schoolteacher in his 30s, living in a narrow apartment, carrying both debts and a sense that his life is slipping sideways. Every evening he drains in front of a screen until the hours drift into sleep, and every morning he wakes to the same list of postponements. I will start tomorrow. I will be different when I have time. The mirror in his bathroom shows a face that knows the truth, that will and circumstance rarely align when will is diffuse. Haru remembers one line from a book he once skimmed: "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise. Seek what they sought." He does not yet understand what those wise ones sought. He thinks they sought victory, or fame, or uninterrupted triumph. What he begins to understand, slowly, is that they sought clarity. The samurai sought a life unbroken by needless choice, a world where the important actions were automatic and the unimportant could be set aside with a clean hand. To build that world, Haru needs a system grounded in one small, non-negotiable action. He chooses an alarm time and a single task: 15 minutes of stillness and deliberate breathing before he touches his phone. That is all. No exercise regime, no grand reading goals, no instant reinvention. On the first morning, he fails. He snoozes twice and opens his phone half asleep, going into the old patterns. The second morning he is better. He sits for 5 minutes, breath uneven, mind wandering. He tells himself tomorrow he will do more. The third morning, he manages 12 minutes. At week's end, his breath has steadied and the edge of his anxiety has thinned. After a month, this small practice becomes a hinge on which his day swings. It is not glamorous, but it is reliable. This is the essence of compete with yesterday. A tiny action, made non-negotiable, repeated until it transforms the architecture of a life. The principle is older than Haru, older even than Bushidō itself. In Zen monasteries, novices learn to sweep the temple floor with a single thought: do not let the mind wander. They are taught to make the simple things sacred: bowing, washing, carrying water, because the discipline of small tasks trains the spirit to stand steady when larger trials arrive. Musashi's method, the samurai's discipline, the monk's attention, these are the same blade seen in different light. There is a psychological truth here that modern language often misses. Identity follows repetition. If you perform small acts with regularity, you begin to think of yourself as the kind of person who performs them. Haru's 15 minutes of stillness do not merely reduce his morning anxiety. they remake a part of him. He begins to tell himself a different story. He is no longer someone who collapses into the day. He is someone who begins it deliberately. That narration changes the choices that follow. He decides to eat differently because the person who sits still tends toward care. He declines social invitations that leave him empty because he now values his morning hinge. Tiny actions generate a change of identity that is quietly irreversible. Musashi taught elimination as much as practice. He argued that mastery comes from subtracting what is unnecessary until only what matters remains. This principle is as applicable to the modern life of inboxes and obligations as it was to the single-mindedness of the sword. Haru begins to apply this. He cancels subscriptions that rarely serve him and stops attending weekend gatherings that exhaust rather than nourish. Each removal is an act of economy, freeing attention for the small practice that anchors him. The samurai did not cling to weapons they did not need. They carried only what made victory more likely. Victory here is not conquest over others, but over distraction. Discipline, in this context, is not a rigid chain. Discipline is fidelity to an inner law that you have chosen and chosen again. It is choosing the same small task on the mornings when every voice in your body argues for inertia. There's a crucible in which habits form, the space of repetition plus resistance. If an action is easy, it yields no change. If it is impossible, it dies. The sweet spot lies in actions that are barely uncomfortable, those that force you to bend, and then, slowly, to straighten. This is the psychological lever that Musashi wielded. Find the minimal effective dose and apply it faithfully. A principle of the samurai often misunderstood is that surrender is a part of strength. Zen teaches acceptance, not of resignation, but of clear awareness that allows for decisive action. In battle, the samurai learned to let go of fear and ego. They did not cling to the fantasy of their own invulnerability. For Haru, surrender looks like admitting his life had become a sequence of avoidances. He surrenders the myth that motivation alone would save him. By surrendering the illusion of grand transformation, he opens himself to the real work of small adjustments. This surrender is not defeat. It is the moment the blade is sharpened. So the method is simple yet profound. Choose one small, non-negotiable action. Eliminate what obstructs it. Repeat it daily and allow identity to shift. But the true test of this method is not immediate comfort. It is resistance. After 3 months, Haru confronts a new trial. A sudden increase in responsibility at the school consumes his afternoons and bleeds into his evenings. Old habits rise as a tide. The phone becomes a refuge again, meals are hurried, and sleep becomes thin. The small practice he had curated is the first thing that threatens to fall away. Here, Musashi's teaching returns. A warrior does not measure himself by victories, but by what remains when everything else is stripped away. To be faithful to the morning ritual in months of stress is to exhibit the courage of small things. Haru finds himself in a moment of choice. He can accept the erosion of his practice and drift back into who he was, or he can guard the tiny hinge with a fierceness that surprises him. He opts for protection. He shrinks the practice back to 10 minutes, refuses evening screen time, and keeps his alarm sacred. He learns to say no with a simplicity that is almost austere. The result is not a sudden bloom, but a slow stabilization. His anxiety recedes not because work is lighter, but because his responses are steadier. This steadiness is the byproduct of systems. Systems allow for action without continuous decision-making. The samurai wore armor so the act of fighting could occur without panic. The armor was part of a system that made the warrior more than a collection of spontaneous responses. For Haru, the morning ritual is armor. He builds other systems, a simple meal plan that requires little deliberation, a ritual for ending work that marks the transition from active effort to rest, and an evening walk that clears the residue of the day. Each system is a small architecture designed to remove friction from what he values. As one system takes root, it frees bandwidth for new, small improvements. This is how a life becomes a sequence of deliberate choices rather than a string of accidents. But systems alone are not enough. There is an inner work that must accompany them: presence. The samurai trained to be fully in each moment because a divided mind fails in battle. Presence is not constant exaltation. It is the repeated return over and over to the task at hand. Haru learns to be present in the 15 minutes, to allow thoughts to pass without chasing them. He is present when he makes the tea, attending to the sound and warmth, not to a future problem. The simple practice of returning to the breath trains a muscle of attention and that the rest of his life depends on. Presence is also a form of mercy. It allows him to meet himself without annihilation. Another lesson from Musashi speaks to the nature of courage. Fear is inevitable. Action is chosen. The samurai did not believe the absence of fear was necessary for skill. Rather, they believed in cultivating a calm that allowed action despite fear. Haru's mornings are not always calm. Sometimes his thoughts surge with obligation and doubt. Yet his small discipline carries him through. Each time he practices despite the fear diminishes in its power to derail him. This is why the phrase, "compete with yesterday," is not an invitation to feel heroic every day. It is an invitation to keep the bar so low and so consistent that you can meet it even when fear is present. There is also the matter of elimination, quietly present in every samurai home. The way of the warrior demands a clarity that cannot coexist with clutter, material, social, or mental. Years later, Haru sits among fewer things, with a wardrobe pared down to what he needs. He does not deprive himself to impress others. He eliminates to preserve attention. He discovers that fewer possessions mean fewer obligations, and fewer obligations mean more energy for the non-negotiables. This is not ascetic showmanship. It is practical alignment between means and ends. When you live with less, the small wins accumulate because your life is less tempted by trivialities. Identity, again, is the silent law that follows action. Haru is not transformed overnight into a paragon of discipline. He becomes, gradually, someone who values a steady morning, who knows how to protect a hinge. His friends notice a slight change in his manner. He speaks less in anger, more in clarity. His work improves because presence yields better attention to detail. He encounters the same challenges: stress, exhaustion, desire to slide back, and meets them with new tools. The small things do not eliminate all hardship, but they change how hardship is met. A man who has practiced small acts of fidelity is less likely to abandon himself when pressure rises. This is where the philosophy of the samurai intersects with modern psychology, the cultivation of micro-discipline to cultivate macro-change. In training himself for small wins, Haru is not tricking himself with ephemeral boosts of willpower. He is designing his environment, lowering the energy cost of right action, and creating habits that outlast motivation. The samurai would approve of this economy. To fight with exhaustion is to court defeat. Better to be prepared through steady, habitual readiness. This readiness is the quiet advantage that shows up not in spectacle but in the narrow corridors of everyday life. There is a common misunderstanding that these practices are about perfection. They are not. Musashi accepted error as a teacher. The samurai embraced the inevitability of mistakes and used them as raw material for improvement. Haru falls many times. He misses mornings, slides into old comforts, but he returns. The return is the point. The discipline is the pattern, not the singular, flawless day. When you only judge yourself by peaks, you become prey to shame. When you judge yourself by return and repetition, you build a structure of resilience. We must speak briefly about silence. The samurai honored silence both as a tactical tool and as a state of mind. Silence is not mere absence of sound. It is the clearing of clutter. In silence, there is room for truth to rise and sharpen. Haru's mornings, those quiet 15 minutes, become a form of cultivated silence. In that silence, he notices small distortions in his thinking, habitual resentments, and tendencies toward comparison. Silence does not dissolve these things by magic, but it reveals them so they can be addressed. The samurai understood that a sword is forged in silence and tested in noise. Likewise, the inner tools are refined in quiet and used when life grows loud. There will be seasons when the hinge seems fragile. Relationships strain, finances tighten, illness or grief may intrude. The method is not a guarantee against suffering. It is a means of standing through suffering with less collapse. In one winter of difficulty, Haru's father falls ill. The time he can devote to his ritual shrinks. He adapts. 5 minutes of breath, seated at the hospital, becomes the practice. He carries his small discipline into new contexts and finds it changes the tone of his presence with his father. He can listen without being swept away. He can be there without losing himself. The small practice is now a vessel for compassion rather than merely self-improvement. This is the deeper end of samurai wisdom. Discipline exists not to harden the heart, but to free it. The warrior's steady practice is not for the sake of conquest, but for the capacity to be fully present to whatever life brings. Musashi did not fight to glorify himself. He fought to live according to a code that sharpened his clarity. Haru learns that the morning hinge makes him more useful to others because it makes him steadier in himself. Small wins create a ripple that reaches beyond the individual. To be clear, this path can feel slow and even unsatisfying to those who crave immediate change. It requires patience that is often misunderstood as passivity. The samurai were far from passive. Their work was active and deliberate, but not frenetic. They practiced the long patience of repetition. If you seek to compete with yesterday, you commit to a tempo that wins through duration rather than drama. There are days that will feel like no progress. There are months that will feel like the same ground walked upon. Keep walking. Musashi's life was a long continuum of practice. His victories were not always spectacular. They were often quiet and cumulative. If you desire to apply this teaching, do not begin with a catalog of problems. Choose one small hinge. Make it non-negotiable. Eliminate one thing that drains attention, even if it is small. Protect the hinge as you would a blade. Repeat. Fail. Return. Adjust. Identity will follow. Presence will deepen. Surrender where surrender is needed. Act with courage where action is required. Do these things without romance, without telling yourself that you will change the world overnight. And in time, the world you inhabit will shift. At the close of his first year, Haru does not become a samurai. He does not achieve perfection. What he has gained, however, is a life with fewer stray impulses and more anchored moments. He is awake in ways he was not before. The small wins have made him stronger in the subtle ways that matter most. Steadiness under pressure, the ability to rest, the capacity to hear another without distraction. He has learned to compete not against others, but against his former self. In doing so, he honors an ancient lineage of practice that valued clarity, elimination, and quiet competence. Musashi's sword cuts through excess because it is honed on a single edge. Your life may be complicated, and the world noisy, but there is a similar edge you can find. The small, non-negotiable actions that carve away distraction. Compete with yesterday not as an act of denial, but as an embrace of what you can control. Let discipline be your fidelity, elimination your economy, presence your armor, and surrender your clarity. In the patient accumulation of small wins, you discover a strength that need not shout to be real. It will be quiet, persistent, and, in the end, unassailable.